So let's go on ahead and get started with Chapter 5, our look at public opinion in the media. We start with the scenario of same-sex marriages. So we ask, should same-sex couples be allowed to marry? Now, how we ask that question, who we ask that question, is going to make a big difference. Americans are almost evenly split on this question, which makes it very hard to find a compromise. But public opinion changes over time. So has that issue. And so this issue is very sharply divided today, but will it be sharply divided tomorrow? Is the issue and public opinion on the issue shifting? There are some indicators that would say that quite possibly that is true. Let's look at what public opinion is. It is defined as a citizen's view on politics and government action. We see some opinions formed very early, and they remain stable throughout a lifetime. We call these, or your textbook calls these, broad expressions. These include such things as party identification, ideology, are we liberal or conservative, beliefs about religion. All of these are really impacted by how you're brought up, your religion, education, level of education, profession, income. A lot of things are going to deal with these. So these don't change very much. But then there are others that do change. They're very fluid. They change as events change. We call these latent opinions. Latent opinions are on-the-spot opinions. These are formed by considerations when we ask a question, and the relevant information comes to mind when an opinion is requested. But then this is where we can get into some trouble. So your answers on these depend on context. They depend on the specified moment in which the person's being asked. So a question about healthcare, a question about war and conflict. If I ask a question about right now about should the United States get into a conflict in the Middle East, it's going to be a different answer than it was 6 months ago, because now we have ISIS and Syria and some very serious implications. And so most people would probably say yes, whereas 6 months ago we would have probably said no. Then other things like government actions, policies, a lot of other things are going to come into play. Political socialization is defined as a process where political opinions are shaped by your parents, by your family, by your community, by your culture. Most people's ideologies and perspectives are relatively stable over time. Mine, I gotta say, mine did not stay stable. As I started teaching government particularly, my views about politics changed somewhat. So as your circumstances change, so might some of the latent opinions, but also some of your socialization. But these are generally stable. These are influenced, again, by your family, your neighbors, your church, your school, your community, your friends and peers. But they are powerful, but not necessarily permanent, because they can also be influenced by events, by your identity with certain groups, by political realignments, or, as in my case, by changing circumstances. This is an opinion poll or a question where we asked different groups different questions and we see the results. So the first is, what do you think about this statement? The Bible is actually the Word of God and is to be taken literally, word for word. And this is, look at the percentage who would agree. As you go male, 28%, female, 39%. With respect to age, those 18 to 30 had 31% agreeing. Those over 55, 36% agreeing. Those with a high school education, 38% agreed. But the more you went down in education, like in advanced degrees, only 11% agreed. Because their views about the interaction between religion and science and social decisions change. Race, 30% of whites said yes, 56% of African Americans, and 36% of others asked. Family income, those with less than $15,000 a year were much more likely than those with more than $25,000. And of course, religion. Region. Those in New England, 17% agreed. But if you look at those in the South, 52% agreed, because that's the Bible Belt. So here's another question. Let's go back. Here's another question. Men are better suited than women for politics. Let's look at the percentage of those who agree. 32% of males said yes. 31% of females said yes. Those 18 to 30, 27% said yes, while those over 55, 42% said yes. So the older you are, the more that you're going to agree with that, probably because of how you were raised. Education. Those with a high school education were much more likely than those with advanced degrees to agree with that statement. Race. 31% of whites, 31% of African Americans, and 31% of others. So it was kind of evenly mixed because this is not a racial question. This is a gender question. Family income. Those with less than $15,000 are much more likely than those with more than $25,000. And region. The New England region, 23% agreed, whereas, again, in the South, 43% agreed. So here's the last question. Government should reduce the income difference between the rich and the poor. Now, in this case, women are more likely to agree than men. Young people and those under the age of 40 are more likely to agree, or as likely to agree. 41 to 55, 19, and over 55, 21%. Government should reduce the income differences between the rich and the poor. In education, those with a high school education, 18% of them agreed. Bachelor's degrees, 9%. Advanced degrees, 11%. Race, 16% of whites versus 33% of African Americans and 26% of other minorities. Family income. 39% of those earning less than $15,000 said yes, and that makes sense because they're the ones that would benefit. And then if you look at those making $20,000 to $25,000, they agreed because that's the middle class. But those with more than $25,000 would disagree, probably because they would be the ones to pay for the equalizing of income. And then by region, those in New England, 16% of them agreed. Mid-Atlantic, 21%. Midwest, 20%. The South is much less likely to agree with that. Those in mountain states, much less likely. And then in the Pacific. So here's a cartoon. And this is Calvin and Hobbes. Here's the latest poll on your performance as dad. Your appraisal rating is pretty low, I'm afraid. That's because there's not necessarily any connection between what's good and what's popular. I do what's right and not what gets approval. And then he says, you'll never keep the job with that attitude. And then the father says, if someone else offers to do it, let me know. Politicians and political parties and party leaders and interest groups and religious leaders, they don't only reflect, but they can also influence political preference. So politicians try to shape opinion rather than pander to it, rather than try to wait for opinion. Oftentimes politics will try to shape it by describing their proposals in a language that would help get public opinion on their side. These efforts, though, are not always successful. And politicians can fail to persuade the public when they have the wrong issue, the wrong message, or bad communication strategies. They don't know how to communicate with the people. Now, how do we know what facts about public opinion are relevant and what people think? So, for instance, 55% of the public supports abortion rights, 38% can't name their congressperson. Most knowledge of public opinion is from a survey. In-person or phone interviews, hundreds of thousands of voters. We can also ask very small focus groups with small numbers of respondents, but then we have to ask the right people. And we can also use these focus groups to help us tap into certain populations, but the random sample is the best way to determine. But then we have problems with sampling error, which describes what percentage of the sample may not be accurate or accurately represent the population. And the more respondents there are, the lower the sampling error will be, because the closer you are getting to what is called a true population. So this is how we measure sample size. It says, hey, if you start off with just a few hundred people, you're going to have a large sampling error, 5 to 6%. But the more that you get to a sample size of, say, 3,000, 4,000 people, if you select the sample size correctly, and if you select the right people, the closer you're going to get to a less than 1% error rate. So what are some of the problems that we have in getting random samples? One is the problem that face-to-face interviewing is best, but it's very difficult to get a random sample from face-to-face interviewing. Then random digit dialing is another way that we do it, where we just go into an area and we start calling random digits. The inability to call cell phone numbers may be a problem. Also, not everybody has a phone. Robopolls face criticisms and doubts because only certain people will answer them because we have call waiting. Also, how we word the question makes a big difference in the answers that we get. So let's look here. Here's a ABC News Washington Post poll from December of 2010. Do you think gays and lesbians who do not publicly disclose their sexual orientation should be allowed to serve in the military or not? 83% said yes, 14% said no, and 4% said they were unsure. Now, if we rephrase the question, do you think gays and lesbians who do publicly disclose their sexual orientation should be allowed to serve in the military? The answer for the number allowed goes down to 77%. Those who they say shouldn't be allowed goes to 21%, and those who are unsure goes to 4%. Again, how we word it. Now, here's another poll from November of 2010. Federal law currently prohibits openly gay men and women from serving in the military. Do you think this law should be repealed? 58% said yes, 34% said no, and 8% said they didn't know. And then here's another poll that was the McClatskey-Morris poll from November of 2010. Do you think the current Democratic Congress should repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell policies and allow gay men and women to serve openly in the military, or do you think they should not repeal it so they continue to serve but not openly? This is a very long-winded, very confusing question. 47% said that they should, 48% said they should not, and 5% were unsure. And here's the thing. All the questions asking the same thing, just in different ways. So the accuracy of public opinion can be changed by or affected by who you ask, when you ask them, the way you ask the question, how you select your sample size. All of these things matter. Some people may not take surveys as seriously as we think they do. The more relevant a survey question is to your life, the more seriously the respondent tends to treat the question, but then you have selection biases. Survey results are most believable when the many problems with surveys are taken seriously by the developer of the survey, when the questions are simple to understand, when the topic is something that people understand what they ask, and when multiple surveys confirm the same result. Let me give you an example. There was a famous poll that was kind of done as a joke where they went out and they started asking people to sign petitions that would basically ban dihydrogen monoxide from the environment, because dihydrogen monoxide is very dangerous and people die from it all the time. Well, if you know what dihydrogen monoxide is, it is H2O. It is water. So people didn't understand the question, and a lot of people signed a petition and said, yes, let's ban dihydrogen monoxide from this planet. Well, of course, we wouldn't survive if we got rid of water, but people didn't understand what they were agreeing to. Now, liberals and conservatives. The liberal conservative ideologies, most of us really would identify ourselves in the middle as moderates. And if you really look at the ideologies, pure ideologies to the right or the left, less than 20% of us are really either liberal or conservative. A few more of us are true conservatives than true liberals. About 10 to 12% of us, maybe 15% or a little less, are going to be true liberals, and about 16 to 18% of us, perhaps, are going to be moderate. But what I want to show you is, over time from 1970 to 2010, the number of people who identified themselves as moderate has really declined slightly, and the number of people who have identified themselves as conservative has risen, while the number of people who have identified themselves as liberal has kind of slightly dipped. Now, this is party identification. Those of us who identify ourselves as independents, Democrats, and Republicans. And you will see that most of us identify ourselves as being independent, but up from 1990 to about 2005, 2010, we really kind of see ourselves, a lot of people see themselves as Democrats. So, in general, if you ask people what they think of the government, they're going to say government sucks. They believe they're disenchanted. They believe that public officials are very wasteful, they're very inefficient, they're uninterested in what average people think. But still, Americans like their own representatives, and they think that their own elected officials are better than those other elected officials that everybody else voted in. Now, this is what we call policy mood. Policy mood deals with the overall types of policies we want. From the 1950s to the 1970s, you had Great Society and expansion of government and the idea that government should step in and fix problems. Then you had the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, and you had more people agreeing with Reagan's policies of conservatism, compassionate conservatism. And this is support for new government programs. So the government programs dealing with conservatism started to rise after the 1980s. And then we start to see support decrease again in the early 1990s with another wave of Republicans. And then we start to go back up. And then we see Barack Obama is elected. So people's opinions of how a public policy shift with the times and with the leaders. Some of the characteristics of American public opinion, we need to look at economic conditions. These affect our public opinion. When we're doing really badly economically, we tend to think that things are going badly in terms of public policy. Americans are almost always worried about the economy, but we need to know, what is the economy? Well, the economy is affecting your wallet. I don't know if you've ever heard the old joke about what's the difference between a depression and a recession. If it's affecting you, it's a recession. If my wallet's affected, it's a depression. So what affects our view of the economy? Well, the price of gasoline, unemployment, especially if you're the one out of a job, the price at the grocery store, the stock market, and the price of homes. Because the home is the most valuable asset we own. So then the question becomes, does public opinion really matter? And the answer is yes. But if it doesn't, then politicians, journalists, and political scientists spend a lot of time worrying about it for nothing. But some would argue that the political process often ignores a lot of people who don't get their voice into those public opinion polls. And this means that public opinion doesn't matter to some people, but it does. So here are some of the arguments against the importance of listening to public opinion polls. Some people are not counted at all, others have accumulated great wealth and influence, and some would argue disproportionate power. Some people believe that divided public opinion results in compromise that fully satisfies no one. And our Constitution makes change, responsiveness to public opinion very difficult. But remember, we do have an acknowledgement that conflict and compromise are a part of our political system. Now, this is the trust in government opinion. And as you can see, trust in government from the 1950s to today has gone pretty much down. Under the Reagan administration, it went up, and then it started going down again. And Clinton, we hit a recession, it went down. Then in the aftermath of September 11th with George Bush, it went up. Then after George Bush, it went down again, especially as we hit financial crises. And then when the debt got downgraded in 2012, 2013, we really hit bottom of trust in government. So right now, people don't really trust government. So let's look at mass media and news. The mass media are sources that provide information to the average citizen on a day-to-day basis. Mainstream media are media sources that predict or predate the internet, and these are things like newspapers and magazines and broadcast news. The news cycle is the amount of time between the release of an information and its publication, and the one thing that's happened is that news cycles have shortened dramatically. They almost don't even exist. So from the time that something happens to the time that we know about it, either by tweeting, twittering, looking at it on CNN, everything can be, it's very rapid. The news cycle is very rapid, and we have a 24-hour news cycle. The other thing we need to understand about media is it used to be that you had network news, and then you had your local news, and the local news was on at 5 or 5:30, and the network news or 6 o'clock, and the network news was on before the local news, and you maybe had it 30 minutes a day, and you had it on 3 channels. Now it's everywhere, and we can actually select the kind of news we want. So what we've become is a narrow-casting society where we select the kind of news and information we want to get, either by the internet, or through tweets and Twitters, or by joining internet groups, or blogs. There's a lot of ways we get our information now. So what is the role of the media? The media is designed to be a watchdog. It's supposed to monitor politicians, government actions, and policy debates. It's supposed to report all of this to the citizen. But it's frequently attracted to spectacles. If it bleeds, it leads is something that is said often in news reporting. So horrific crimes, political and celebrity scandals, and then making elections into horse races. Instead of talking about the issues, we talk about who's doing better in the polls, and this sometimes influences the way that people behave. So this gives rise to the common media sayings like sex sells, if it bleeds, it leads. Worse even is that the media can rush to judgment based on non-existent or flimsy evidence. So I don't know if y'all know about the balloon boy hoax, but there was a boy whose father wanted to get onto a reality show, so he calls in and says that he had been building a balloon in the backyard, and that there was a little boy caught in the balloon, and the balloon took off, and they all of a sudden everybody starts following this balloon, and they said this boy was in the balloon. Well, in reality, it was a hoax. The boy was never in the balloon. He was hiding in his room because the dad told him to. So it was an unsophisticated ploy for attention, but he got the attention he wanted because everybody rushed to judgment that this boy was indeed in the balloon. The boy was never in the balloon. So let's look at the sources of our news. Things are changing. Newspapers, magazines, and books are going to be less reliable because the lapsing time, the time to get them published, is very, very long. Now, newspapers are moving over to internet. Magazines and books, the same thing. So print is not the way to go. It's multimedia. Your wire services, your TV broadcast news, cable television, AM talk radio, which again is very biased, internet. And then we need to look at how to compare these sources of information. So we look at things like how much lead time does this have? The more lead time you have, the more you can sit back on a story and verify its accuracy and know that it's correct. What's the cost versus the profit? If you print a story and then retract it later, but everybody wants to read that story, even if it's wrong, you're benefiting. And so that's what oftentimes they do. Better to apologize later than not to publish it. What's the appeal to the audience? If it leads, it bleeds. If it bleeds, it leads. What's technological impact? The internet is by far the most important medium to consider today, and it has the shortest lead time. So things get out there very quickly, and they may not be accurate. The rise of digital media has transformed the media industry, and we've seen an increasing number of Americans get their news and other information from online sources. So how does this change affect the role of the media in politics? So as a news medium, we see the internet including things like sites that represent online versions of offline media products like the New York Times and CNN. Sites that primarily are or only available online, such as Politico.com, Pollster.com, and other blogs. And then social media sites, Facebook, Twitter. These things help spread things very quickly, but the question is, how accurate are they? So we've had some very important changes within the internet. Information is more valuable than it used to be. Access to information is so critical. It's more available on a wider range of stories. Media outlets are no longer limited strictly by the time, the space. Because you have blogging, Twittering, Facebooking, videos, you can expand the story out and put out something on the internet and then talk about it in your 2-minute sound bites. There are barriers to publication that have been lowered. Before the bar, these barriers were lowered, the bar for who could create news was very high. Now anybody can be a publisher of a blog. Anyone with an internet connection can participate by tweeting, by Facebooking, anything they want to do. And this has its positives and it has its negatives. But the question becomes, are we better informed? Despite the growth of information sources like the internet, citizens have not become as informed as we might hope. The access levels are high, but access is just the first step because we have to know how to use the information. The users need to know where to find good, reliable information that does more than just confirm a pre-existing belief. We don't want to just stick with MSNBC or Fox because both of those are very biased. So the other problem is the deregulation of mass media control. Media conglomerates, companies that control a very wide range of news sources, they control a lot of the major sources of news and information. And this is another problem. We get to the idea of internet neutrality, net neutrality. Should certain companies have more control over bandwidth and access to bandwidth than others? Should I, as a small blogger, have less access to bandwidth than CNN? Cross-ownership is another problem. One company owns several different kinds of media outlets, and they often are in the same community. It used to be you couldn't own more than one television station. In El Paso, both Channel 9 and Channel 4 out of the same company. The same company owns them. So there have been two sources of pressure to deregulate. One is things like new technologies, cable, satellite, and the internet have given birth to new corporations where old regulations seemed rigid and out of date, so we changed the regulations. And broadcast regulations, for instance, forbidding profane language, don't apply to a non-broadcast media like cable. At the same time, media conglomerates wanted to bypass restrictions on cross-ownership, and now they have done that. And again, that leads to the problem of who controls the media. So if we look here about knowledge levels by news source, we actually see that the Daily Show and the Colbert Report actually had a larger, more knowledgeable audience across a lot of spectrums than did network reporting and local television. And that's amazing. We're getting our information in a lot of different ways. So if you watch the Daily Show and you watch Colbert, you're probably even more informed than if you don't. So what are the effects of the media on our perceptions of politics? Media affects the influence of coverage on the average citizen's opinions, their actions. Filtering. Do we have filters in place individually? Filtering is the influence on public opinion that results from a journalist and an editor's decision about which of the many potential news stories will be reported. Then the slant. A slant is an imbalance or a bias that's taken on a story that covers one candidate or policy favorably without providing similar coverage to the other side. Do we have slants in different media sources? Of course we do. Another issue, priming, is the influence on the public's general impressions that are caused by positive or negative coverage of a candidate or an issue. So, can the media prime the pump? The answer is yes. How about framing things? The influence on public opinion that is caused by the way a story is presented or covered, including the details, the explanations, and the context. How is the story being framed? All of these should be part of our personal filters as we look at news events. So then we get to public opinion polls. Do you agree or disagree that the policies of the United States government represent the preferences and opinions of the American people? Do you strongly agree with that? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Or do you strongly agree? Notice how we put this. We want 4 or 5 point scales. Usually a 5-point scale is even better because we should have one that says neither agree nor disagree. So here's another question for you. Americans vary enormously in their knowledge about government and politics, yet we treat all opinions as having equal weight. Should everyone's political opinions be treated equally? What do you think? Yes or no? We're going to be looking at these this week in our discussions. Which of the following political values do you believe is most important? Is it equality or opportunity, liberty, or democracy? Which of these do you feel has had the greatest influence on your political values? Is it family? Social groups like race, religious, and national groups? Is it education? Is it political conditions and experiences? Is it religion? Which of these sources do you most frequently use to get your news? Is it the internet, the newspaper, the television, or do you just not follow the news at all? I hope you don't. I hope you follow the news. Do you believe that the media has a conservative or liberal bias, or do you believe that there's no real political bias? And when you watch the news on TV, what station are you most likely to watch? Is it CNN? Is it Fox? Is it MSNBC? Or is it any of the major news stations like ABC, CBS, and NBC? Or is it something else? During a typical week, how many days do you watch or read the news, not including the sports or the internet? Is it 0, 1 to 2, 3 to 4, or more, or 5 or more? And how do you feel about this? There should be limits on media criticism of the government during a time of war. Do you agree or disagree? And that ends our discussion this week of politics, political data, decision making, and polling.